Nixon warned Clinton that Russia would attack Ukraine. Richard Nixon understood Russia better than anyone. In 1972, he was the first sitting president to visit Moscow. After leaving office, he kept many contacts. In 1994, Nixon took a 2-week trip to Russia in Ukraine. The 81-year-old ex-president died a month later, but he left one final piece of advice. Nixon wrote a letter to President Bill Clinton. It was only declassified in 2023. Nixon warned Yeltsin's brief dalliance with democracy was over.
I have reluctantly concluded that his situation has rapidly deteriorated. His drinking bouts are longer, and his periods of depression are more frequent. Most troublesome, he can no longer deliver on his commitments to you and other Western leaders in an increasingly anti-American environment in the Duma and in the country.
Nixon also called the situation in Ukraine highly explosive.
If it is allowed to get out of control, it will make Bosnia look like a PDA garden party.
Nixon was worried about American ignorance. He stressed that Ukraine was important.
Because of the importance of Ukraine, I reluctantly urge that you immediately strengthen our diplomatic representation in Kiev.
Nixon was also worried about Yeltsin's successor. In 1994, Yeltsin was 5 years away from retirement, but there was no way of knowing who'd take his place.
Bush made a mistake in sticking too long to Gorbachev because of his close personal relationship. You must avoid making that same mistake in your very good personal relationship with Yeltsin.
Of course, Nixon had no knowledge of Putin. In 1994, his name was unknown to most Russians, but Nixon was worried Yeltsin would be succeeded by a hardliner.
The Russians are serious people. One of the reasons Khrushchev was put on the shelf back in 1964 is that the proud Russians became ashamed of his crude antics at the UN and in other international forums.
The analogy is transparent. Nikita Khrushchev was succeeded by Leonid Brezhnev. He stepped up internal repression and invaded Afghanistan. Nixon wrote that a nationalist tide in Russia could produce a credible candidate for president. He was worried about the survival of Russian democracy.
The most important foreign policy issue the nation will face for the balance of this century.
Nixon also warned Clinton about over-reliance on his advisors.
I learned during my years in the White House that the best decisions I made, such as the one to go to China in 1972, were made over the objections of, or without the approval of, most Foreign Service officers. Remember that Foreign Service officers get to the top by not getting into trouble. They are therefore more interested in covering their asses than in protecting yours.
Clinton apparently didn't take Nixon's advice to heart. However, he did praise the ex-president's Russia expertise. In his eulogy, Clinton even referred to the letter.
For the past year, even in the final weeks of his life, he gave me his wise counsel, especially with regard to Russia. Based on our last phone conversation and the letter he wrote me just a month ago, I can say that his spirit was very much alive to the very end.
Clinton was the first U.S. president to meet Putin. They met in Auckland, New Zealand, in September 1999. Putin had just been appointed prime minister. His reign would begin with Yeltsin's resignation 4 months later.